Well, our AASB 11 joint arrangements. Now, joint arrangements, it's all about joint control, and it's closely linked to AASB 10. Because before you can apply AASB 11, you have to ask whether some parties collectively have control over another entity. Now, if we've got an entity with 5 shareholders, you don't need all 5 to have joint control. It could be that the 5 shareholders each have 20% voting rights, and let's say voting rights is the key thing, just for my example. If 3 of them get together in terms of a contract, we could say the 3 of them collectively have control over the investee. So the very first thing is to determine whether a subset of the investors or the shareholders have control, and control as defined in AASB 10. Therefore, control again is no longer this fixed bright line of 50%, but still looking at power over relevant activities, variable returns. So that's the first thing. Step 1, is there a contractual arrangement that gives them that power, give them that control? And I think I should clarify contractual arrangement. Usually contractual arrangement, when I read it, I think a written contract. However, AASB 11 goes further and says it could be a verbal agreement. But if it's a verbal agreement, I reckon the auditors would like to see some written evidence of the verbal agreement, whether it's notes, whether it's minutes of a meeting, etc. So we're looking for some evidence that we've decided that together we'll have control and make decisions together. So that's the first thing. The second step is, do we have that control by a number of people? And the second thing, which is absolutely crucial, is do those people need unanimous consent to make decisions? It's all about unanimous consent. Now you have to be careful when you look at those contracts. If we've got 2 people or 2 parties involved, and the contract says each party can appoint 2 people to the board of the investee. So now we've got 2 from entity A, 2 from entity B. Next question. If 2 vote yes and 2 vote no, what do we do? If it's true unanimous consent, nothing will happen, we can't go ahead. So how do we resolve that situation? If we say the chairman will have the final say, my next question would be, who appoints the chairman? Right? And if we say entity A always appoints the chairman, then we no longer have unanimous consent. Then entity A actually has control in its own right. So it's really important to go and look at these contracts around joint arrangements and specifically investigate whether you really have unanimous consent. Right, so we need joint control by a number of parties. We need unanimous consent by those parties in order to be in AASB 11. Once we're in AASB 11 joint arrangements, the decision is, do we have a joint operation or do we have a joint venture? Now, a joint operation would usually be where I'm still liable for certain liabilities, and I've got a right to certain assets. So I've put in my assets. If this new joint arrangement incur liabilities, the joint arrangement is liable for those liabilities, but they could come to me as a joint operator as well to pay some of those liabilities. So there's kind of a look through to the joint operators. And in that situation, you account for your part of the assets and liabilities, your part of the income and the expenses, etc. Compare that to a joint venture where you have a right only to net assets, and usually your obligation or your liability is contained to the joint arrangement. So that joint venture would be responsible for liabilities. If the joint venture can't pay the liabilities, usually they can't come after the parties involved. So it's important to look at that, whether they can come to you and say, you now have to stand in. And remember, it's not only in the name. If there's a contract over this whole arrangement that says, listen, I'll pick up liabilities or I'll guarantee liabilities, you have to think carefully whether it's a joint venture or it's actually a joint operation. So joint venture is I've got rights to the net assets and I only have rights to the net assets and I'm only responsible for whatever I've put into that arrangement up front. So that's the key distinguishing factor. In the old days, we had this whole thing about jointly controlled assets, jointly controlled entities, etc. All of that is gone. It's all about joint operation, joint venture, and whether you've got an interest in net assets or whether you've got an interest in individual assets and liabilities. There's still this question, is if this joint arrangement is structured through a separate vehicle, what does that mean? If it's a separate vehicle, so it's a separate partnership, a separate company, something out there separate, does that automatically mean we've got a joint operation or a joint venture? AASB 11 at least gives us an answer to this and says if it's not structured through a separate vehicle, if it's an agreement that we work together, all the income and expenses are not running through a separate legal entity or a separate structured vehicle, it can only be a joint operation. However, as soon as it's structured through a separate vehicle, you still have to consider the legal form of the separate vehicle. You have to consider the terms of any contractual arrangement, because there could still be a contract that says they can come to you and you will pay the liabilities, as an example. And you should also consider other facts and circumstances. So other facts and circumstances, if we are working together and whatever we manufacture, we'll just share between the two parties and each party will then go and do whatever they want with the product. Usually it's a joint operation. So we're not in it to make money at that stage. We're in it to create a certain product which we distribute between the two investors involved. However, if we are in it to manufacture a product and go and sell the product and make a profit going forward, that starts to sound more like a joint venture because we want to make profit in its own right. The other thing is, if you are providing the cash flows for this joint arrangement to keep it going on a year-to-year basis, usually it's a joint operation. If this arrangement can sustain and create its own cash flows and operate on its own, without these investors, usually it starts to feel like a joint venture again. They make profits, own cash flows, pay their own liabilities. So those are all the facts and circumstances we have to look at. To me, always I ask the question about who's responsible for the liabilities of the joint arrangement. I think that's a key thing to consider. All right, that's me personally. I want to know that. Then, next one. So if you, again, want to go through this process, a stepped approach, I would start with, is the joint arrangement structured through a separate vehicle? If you say no, joint operation immediately. If you say yes, it is in a separate vehicle, now you have to ask about the legal form. Now you have to ask, are there any other contracts? Now you have to ask about other facts and circumstances. Do they make profit? Do they sustain their old cash flows? Do they sell their output or do they use their output? Right, so that's kind of a decision to go through.